ta'ala. اللهم إنا نسألك فهم النبيين وحفظ المرسلين وإلهام الملائكة المقربين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين يا أرحم الراحمين. أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We thank and we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all His countless favors that He has bestowed upon us, and we send salutations upon the beloved of Allah, beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And in the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he said, Imaan, an tu'mina billahi wa malaikatihi wa kutubihi wa rusulihi wa bil yawmil akhir wa bil qadri khayri wa sharri. To believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His prophets and His books and in the day of Qiyamah, and that all good and all bad is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Sayyidina Jibreel replied again that you are right, O Prophet of Allah. And they were shocked again. So Sayyidina Jibreel asked the third time, tell me what is Iman, tell me what is Ihsan. And so the Prophet ﷺ replied, and he said, Ihsan an ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara, fa illam takun tara fa innahu yarak. That Ihsan is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see Him, and even though you do not see Him, know that He sees you. And then Sayyidina Jibreel asked again, he said, now tell me about, he said, Akhbirni an Isa, tell me when is Qiyamah, what will happen in Qiyamah. And the Prophet ﷺ replied and he said that the one that is being asked does not know more than the one that is asking. Meaning that the Prophet ﷺ, he knew just as much as the one that is asking. He never knew anything. And so Sayyidina Jibreel said that, tell me about the signs of Qiyamah. So the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned two. He mentioned that when a slave gives birth to a master, meaning that the slave has intercourse with the master. In that time when you had a slave that had a master, has intercourse with the master, and the master has a child, meaning that that child also has ownership over the slave. And another one would be when you find that there would be poor people without shoes walking around naked. They would be walking around naked, and they would have money, they would be wealthy, right? And then afterwards, to get to the point that Sayyidina Jibreel left, the man left that they saw. He left after a while, and after a while the Prophet ﷺ, he asked them, did you know who was that just came? And he said, Allah Rasulu Alam, that Allah and His Prophet know best. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said that was Sayyidina Jibreel, he came to teach you your deen, right? And so when we understand that He came to teach you your deen, you understand that there are three fundamental pillars in your deen. If your religion is a house, or your religion is a masjid, right? If you don't have the pillars in the masjid is going to fall apart. If you don't have certain walls in your house, it's going to fall apart. So you need three fundamental pillars in your deen to make sure it works out. Islam, Iman, Ihsan. When we study Islam, to understand Islam, we will study fiqh. We will study Islamic law. Because if you want to know how to make salah, you study fiqh, they teach you how to make salah. If you want to learn how to give zakah, you study fiqh, teach you how to give zakah. It teaches you the conditions of going on hajj. It teaches you how to fast, right? That's fiqh, if you want to understand Islam. And when you go further and you go to Iman, for Iman you study something called Tawheed, something called Aqeedah. Aqeedah means belief. Tawheed means monotheism. And in Tawheed you learn to understand the characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you cannot truly understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so you understand His characteristics. And once you start to understand something, or the characters of something more, the characteristics of something more, you start to believe in it more. So to completely believe in something, you need to learn about it. So for that you study Iman, and you learn about the characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you learn about the characteristics of the prophets, and you learn what is an angel, what are the angels created from. You learn about Qiyamah and the signs of Qiyamah and all the things that will happen during Qiyamah to make your belief firm. And once your belief is firm, you start to believe in something more. Once you understand something, you believe in it more. So for Iman, you study Aqeedah. And for Ihsan, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. To worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see Him, and even though you don't see Him, know that He sees you. To get to this point, you need to have a pure heart. You need to purify your heart. So we study something called Tazkiyah. Alright? There are many names. You call it Tazkiyah, some call it Ihsan, some call it Tasawwuf. There are many names, but you call it Tazkiyah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ Zakah, speaking about the nafs, speaking about the heart, that the successful one is the one that purifies his nafs, purifies his heart. And you can only truly understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first of all, there are 20 characteristics that are compulsory, right? In Aqeedah, there is something that's compulsory, something that is mustahil, and something that is jaiz. Right? Something that is inevitable, inconceivable, and conceivable. Right? Wajib meaning something that is inevitable. It has to be there. Mustahil, inconceivable. Something that inconceivable. We understand inconceivable. Jaiz, something that is conceivable, meaning that we can think about it, we can imagine it being there, we can imagine it not being there. So when you speak about what is wajib, right? There are 20 characteristics that are wajib upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. 20 characteristics. And there's a poetry. They will always say if you want to study something, or if you want to learn something, then memorize poetry. Because if you memorize poetry, you'll start to understand it better. So there's poetry called Aqeedatul Awam. It's been translated if you want to search it up. It's poetry written about Aqeedah, and he mentions all 20. So if you want to memorize the 20 sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, memorize. He said, فَاللَّهُ مَوْجُودٌ قَدِيمٌ بَاقٍ مُخَالِفٌ لِلْخَلْقِ بِالْإِطْلَاقِ وَقَائِمٌ غَنِيٌّ وَاحِدٌ وَحَيٌّ قَادِرٌ مُرِيدٌ عَالِمٌ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ سميع البصير والمتكلم له صفات سبعة تنتظم قدرة إرادة سمع بصر حياة علم كلام استمر. He mentions all 20 wajib characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All 20 inevitable characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the opposite of those inevitable characteristics are those which are inconceivable. And then there's only one that is conceivable, meaning the one that is conceivable is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the power to do what He wants. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create something, He can uncreate something, or He cannot create something at all. So once we understand that, we have inevitable, inconceivable, conceivable. Right? So those three we are going to speak about. We speak about the characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for Aqeedah, it's a subject, fiqh, if you listen and you understand, you understand. How to make salah, you memorize the conditions. Aqeedah is something we have to take note. You have to listen, preferably if you can, you record it, or you come with a book and you write down and you go back and listen to it again and again. So when you speak about the first characteristic, wujud, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is omnipresent. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is at the same time. Right? And you want to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere. That first, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mujud. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. Right? When we study Aqeedah, we need proof for everything. When we study fiqh, we need proof. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, make salah. Right? Where's the proof? So in Aqeedah, we have the same. We have dalil aqli, and we have two types of proof. Dalil aqli and dalil naqli. We have Quran and Sunnah. It's fine. That's all we need. Somebody that's Muslim, he takes Quran and Sunnah. I tell him, okay. Takes majority of Muslims take Quran and Sunnah. But a non-Muslim, a philosopher, he comes to you, how are you going to explain to him? They don't take Quran and Sunnah. They're not Muslim. They don't understand Quran and Sunnah. So how do you explain something to them? Right? Logical evidence. If a Mu'tazili comes to you, right? So how are you going to explain something to him if you don't have logical evidence? So for that we have evidence from the Quran and Sunnah, and evidence, logical evidence. Right? Quran and Sunnah is called naqli, and logical evidence is called aqli. Right? So the first one, if we look at naqli, how do we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, فَلْيَنْظُرِ الْإِنسَانُ مِمَّا خُلِقَ. Right? How were they created? From what were they created? They just come into being, or they created out of something. And to understand that more, you'll understand that more when we go into the logical evidence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. That if you think, and you ponder, and you reflect, you will find that everything in this world, it can't just come into existence. Right? إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. For those that ponder also, and those that claim to have intellect, when you look at everything around you, you find the sign that is a creator. Right? So there are many ayahs in the Quran. Right? If you go read. Allah subhanahu, a simple one, Kul wallahu ahad. Allahu samad. Lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, say. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, tell him, say, Kul wallahu ahad, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. Right? So there are many evidences mawjood, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is omnipresent, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present. But the point of these classes is not to mention all the dalil naqli. We don't sit in the class and mention every ayah in the Quran, every ayah in Sunnah. The point of this class is to make you understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present. Why we start with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's omnipresence is because you can't go and learn that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-seeing. You can't go and learn that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-hearing. You can't go and learn that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does what He pleases until you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is present. Until you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. So you start with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's omnipresence. So now, if we go to the logical evidence, right? Because the way our minds work, and we always use it, if we come to the masjid, we use the same example. Last time when we did the class before, we used the same example because we find it's the easiest example to understand this concept. Right? Every incident needs a trigger. So I'll first give an example. Every incident needs a trigger. So for example, the fan, right? The fan, it won't start moving until you press the switch. Right? The fan is an incident. It won't start moving until you press the trigger. So, unless there's a trigger, the fan won't move. Your fridge, your electronic, right? So we understand that any incident needs a trigger. Right? Any incident needs a determinant. Right? And if you want to use a smaller word, an easier word, every incident needs a decision maker. Right? That's the simplest way. Every incident needs a decision maker. Every occurrence needs a decision maker. Right? So, if you go work somewhere, if you get a job and you go work somewhere, and your boss doesn't tell you, or the boss, he doesn't say that you have to be at work at a certain time. Right? The boss doesn't say you have to be at work at a certain time. So you don't know when you have to be at work. Right? The boss never set the time to be at work, so you don't know when you have to be at work. So there was no decision maker to set the decision. Right? That's a micro level. So if we say that if time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Or an example, like we were saying, the trigger, right? Or the determinant, or the decision maker did not create time, then there will be no time. Logically, time cannot. So that was time, right? If we want to understand that the universe is an incident, because like scientists say that the universe was created from a Big Bang explosion, that created the universe. The first fault in that, right, is that if you take a bomb and you throw it, what's going to happen? It's going to explode. It's going to cause havoc. It's going to make a big mess. So how can an explosion create the whole universe that was perfectly set, each planet on its place in a completely beautiful system? Right? Logically, think about it. So the universe refers to anything and everything other than God. Anything and everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You and I, the masjid, the earth, the universe, the stars, everything is considered, the stars, the skies, the planets, is all considered part of the universe. Everything except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this continuously expanding universe, including all its stars, galaxies, objects, animals, plants, and non-living things. And if we were to also look at the components of this universe, we would find that any of the components can either be in motion or in a static state. Right? So something can either, so if you look at all of these things, whether it's the stars, the animals, the planets, objects, galaxies, anything, it's one of two things. It's either in motion or static, right? Either moving or stagnant. So motion is an incident. Motion is an occurrence, right? Because it happened to an object that was previously static. Right? Motion came into existence after being non-existent. And this is what an incident is, something coming into existence after being non-existent. So the concept of motion came into existence after being stagnant, right? After being a static motion. That fan, once you press the trigger, started moving, after not moving. After it was in a state of stagnancy, it went into a state of motion. So, just like that, right, motionlessness or stagnancy is an incident. Why? Because it happened to an object after it, right? If we look at it from another view, we can also say that all components of this world are subject to change. Everything is subject to change, right? If we go back there, right, from this view, we make a straight line back there. From movement to stagnancy, right? State of change, movement, stagnancy, movement. Another example, that light that goes on, goes off, right? Micro examples, right? That is subject to change. We said every incident needs a trigger, right? So we have the universe. Everything inside the universe is either in a state of motion or in a static state. Right? It's either moving or it's not moving. Either moving or stagnant. Either a state of motion or motionlessness. Right? And both of these things are considered an incident, right? Motion is considered an incident because it came into existence after being in a static state. And something that's in a static state, something that is motionlessness, came into existence from something that was moving. Right? And because each of these things came into existence, it's both considered an incident, it's both considered an occurrence. That's the one view. And if we go to this side and we say that everything is subject to change. Right? So you say everything is subject to change, meaning that everything must be an incident. Why? Because if it's subject to change, meaning that it came out of non-existence. Right? So if it came out of a state of non-existence, it's an incident, because being an incident, for something to be an incident, it entails that it must have a trigger. Right? And like we explained, that something can't just naturally come into existence. Right? So it needs a trigger. So if we understand that the universe is an incident, right? And we understand Why is the universe an incident? Because everything in it is subject to change. And everything that is subject to change is considered an incident. So therefore the universe and everything that is in it is considered an incident. Alright? And an incident needs a trigger. Alright? Meaning that everything in the universe needed something to bring it into creation. Meaning that everything in the universe needed a trigger. Everything in the universe needed a creator. Alright? So not only everything is subject to change, right? And whatever is subject to an incident. So this universe with all its content, with all its contents, right? Like we explained, must either be in a state of motion or stagnancy, right? So because the universe, right? If you look at it from another view, right? Easier way. So because the universe, use the same thing. Because the universe, so that everybody can see. If we say that, it's fine, it's fine. So everything that is subject to an incident is an incident, right? So look at it like this. If we take this, everything, universe is subject to motion and motionlessness, right? So whatever is subject and motionlessness are incidents. So whatever is subject to an incident is an incident. So therefore, because the universe is subject to one of these two states, the universe given an attribute by incidence must itself be an incident. Again, whatever is given attribute. And whoever, it's three things that we mentioned. Whoever doesn't understand, you can go